First time I saw this sign, I think you will see it right behind me on the screen, the sign that said, "Mind the gap." The first thing I thought to myself is, what gap? Yet, if you've ever traveled to London, or if you ever will go to London, then when you go on the subway there called the Tube, you'll see that sign everywhere on the platform right before you enter the train entrance. And not only will you see it, you will hear it said again and again, "Please mind the gap." And the more I saw it and the more I heard it, the more I asked myself, why? Why do you need that sign at all? Where's the gap? Now, generally when I've traveled to London, I've been kind of grateful for unnecessary signs. For example, when you go to London and you cross the street, they will have a little sign telling you which way to look. And they do that because in England, they drive on the other side of the road, what they would call the right side of the road. And so those signs are there to direct clueless travelers who might end up looking the wrong direction, for which I'm grateful because I wouldn't be here. I would be some hood ornament on the front of a taxi if those signs had been there. But when it came to mind the gap, I couldn't see the reason. But then I did a little research and I discovered that in certain stations, as the platform curves, that gap between the platform and the entrance to the train can get pretty wide. And every year, hundreds of people actually do fall into the gap. Now, generally, if you do, you can pull yourself out or someone will be there to pull you out. But every now and then, someone falls into the gap and they get missed. And when that happens, it's not pretty. A few years ago, a man right about my age fell into the gap. And because half of his body was below the platform, the driver of the train couldn't see him waving frantically for help in his mirror. And so he pulled out and crushed the lower half of his body. And then another train arrived and crushed the other half. After reading that, I began to have more appreciation for minding the gap. In fact, I began to think, gosh, I wish I had a sign like that in my life every day. Because in life, you and I have gaps. Gaps between who we are and who we yearn to be. And sometimes, under the stresses of life or when life gets particularly heavy, those gaps can get wider and you can fall into them. And when that happens, it's not pretty either. In fact, it happened in my life just a few weeks ago. And it was not pretty. Something occurred that irritated me. And looking back, it wasn't really that big a thing. But between what had happened and what was going on inside of me that week, I just went off on the people involved. I mean, I just lost it. And while thankfully nobody died, damage definitely got done. Falling into the gap can be brutal. Have you ever fallen into a gap like that? Maybe you had a moment where you lost it like I did, or maybe you just fell into a dark place in your life and you struggled to get back out. Maybe you made a foolish decision that normally you wouldn't make, but the stresses of those moments led you there. falling into the gap can really be brutal. Even at times deadly. After all, what is suicide or falling into addiction, but falling into a particularly deep gap? One that's very difficult to get out of. But here's the thing. You don't have to fall into a gap for it to limit your life. See, gaps can limit your life every day, preventing you from experiencing everything God has for you, experiencing that presence that God is with you in every moment. And yet in life, you can start missing those gaps, not even noticing they're there. But even as you do so, they're still there, limiting you, holding you back, preventing you from experiencing what God has for you. So how do you see the gaps? How do you mind them? And more crucially, how do you find ways to narrow them? Well, in these words, these quite famous words from Jesus' most famous sermon, Jesus shows you the way. So let's listen and hear what Jesus has to say. And this sermon is typically called the Sermon on the Mount because it occurred like on a hillside in Galilee where Jesus began his ministry. And it begins with these kind of words that I think many people have heard but never really quite understood, known as the beatitudes. Listen and hear the word of the Lord. When Jesus saw the crowds, he went up the mountain. And after he sat down, his disciples came to him, and he began to speak and taught them, saying, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Now, what do these words about mourning have to do with the gaps in your life? Well, that is what Jesus is calling you to mourn. Jesus is calling you to grieve your gaps, the gaps between who you are and who you yearn to be, who God created you to be. And why does Jesus want you to grieve your gaps? Because grieving your gaps opens you to the presence of God like nothing else. Now, how does that sort of mourning do that? Well, to do that, we need to do a quick review of what we began talking about last week. See, because last week, Jesus said that the kingdom of heaven isn't some ethereal thing out there somewhere. It's not something that you experience only when you die. Jesus said the kingdom of heaven, God's very presence, God's wondrous beauty and goodness is with you right here, right now. The problem is you miss it. You don't see it. There's a penitential, like a prayer for forgiveness, that is prayed before the Sabbath in Jewish households that says it so well. And the prayer goes like this: days pass, years vanish, and we walk sightless among miracles. Sightless among miracles. Do you see what the prayer is telling you? It's telling you that sightlessness is your default. You are regularly walking around sightless among miracles. So how do you begin to see? Well, Jesus says you acknowledge your sightlessness, your blindness. You experience, as Jesus puts it, your poverty of spirit, your need for something, someone more, a higher power. And as you acknowledge that poverty of spirit, that blindness, you begin to see. You begin to see that God's presence is with you all around you, that the kingdom of heaven isn't out there. It is here with you right now. And I'm not saying this, Jesus is. Jesus doesn't say, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs shall be the kingdom of heaven. He says, blessed are the poor in the spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Present tense, right now. And that is why Jesus calls those who know poverty of spirit the most fortunate of all people. See, that's what that word blessed means there. It's a Greek word, makarios. And the word describes people who have won life's lottery, who've experienced tremendously good fortune in their life. And Jesus is saying that when you have poverty of spirit, when you experience the presence of God like that, the kingdom of heaven coming, then you are the most fortunate of all people, the most blessed. So, isn't that easy? You just acknowledge your poverty of spirit, your blindness, and voila, the kingdom of heaven is there. Yes and no. See, if you've grown accustomed to walking sightless among miracles for most of your life, it may take a while for you to begin to see. In other words, everyone has the potential to experience poverty of spirit, but in order to experience it and to truly see will require some level of attention, even training on your part. Think about it like, say, running the Boston Marathon. They ran that race just last week. I think it's been the 125th running of that, the longest continuing marathon in history. And I happen to run a little bit, emphasis on the little. So, could I run a marathon? Could I run 26.2 miles? No way. But let's say if tomorrow I started training and extending my mileage bit by bit, then by this time next year, could I run a marathon? Most definitely. Now, I won't do that, but I could. In the same way, experiencing the kingdom of heaven, experiencing poverty of spirit, requires a little bit of training, a little bit of exercise, but thankfully far less than it would if it were a marathon. And in these words, where Jesus invites you to mourn, to grieve your gaps, Jesus is introducing you to just such a way. Because when you grieve your gaps, you open yourselves to the presence of God like never before. Now, how does that happen? After I do run my little bit in the morning, as I mentioned last week, I take a cool down walk. And as I do so, I pray a prayer called the Jesus Prayer. It's not a prayer I came up with. It's literally been one Christians have been praying for over 1,500 years. And if a prayer is stuck around that long, you got to know it's got to be a powerful one. And indeed, it is. But you may not notice the power initially because the words are quite simple. It's simply, Jesus, Lamb of God, have mercy on me, a sinner. And you simply repeat or meditate upon those words. And as you do, the power comes. Now, what is the source of its power? The source of its power is that it leads you to grieve your gaps. Because as you meditate upon that prayer, Jesus Christ, Lamb of God, by the way, a perfect selection for the song, Worthy is the Lamb. Have mercy on me, a sinner. You begin to think about all those places in your life that you lose touch with God's presence and peace. You begin to think about those moments of pettiness in your life. How self-involved you can get. Maybe, if you're honest, even a bit selfish. You think about those moments where you get caught in self-pity or maybe self-righteousness. And as you get in touch with your gaps, as you get in touch with them, you begin to feel the grief there. The distance between who you are and who you yearn to be and who God created you to be. And you begin to feel sadness, grief, regret. Your heart begins in some small way to break. But in those moments, something happens. Something wondrous. You become open to the presence of God like never before. Now, how does that happen? You see, when you were a child and you were sad, everybody knew it because your face told the story. And often, not just your face, but often your voice. You cried out, and hopefully someone came running to help. But as you got older, in the vagaries and twists and turns of life, you became more guarded. Your face became more guarded. You learned to manage your face so that you could walk around looking happy when inside you were feeling anything but. And in those moments, not only did you grow disconnected from showing that to the world, sometimes you grew disconnected from showing it to yourself. Your heart became closed, hardened, guarded, and you lost touch with you, with that sadness and grief within. But that prayer opens that place up. There's a prayer, not a prayer, a story actually, that comes from the Hasidic tradition of Judaism that explains it well. A student is talking to his teacher, his rabbi, and he says, "Rebbe, why does the Torah, the book of the law, say, place these words upon your heart? Why doesn't it say, place these words in your heart?" And the Rebbe replies, but your heart is closed. And so the words can only be placed upon your heart. But when your heart breaks, the words fall in. And when you pray that prayer, and when you feel the grief, and your heart breaks just a bit, then the living Word, the Word that became flesh, falls in. And you realize that He has been there all along, waiting and yearning to comfort you in your pain and grief. But now this presence has moved in, has fallen in, and as Jesus does, He opens your eyes for you to see the presence of God with you in that very moment. And suddenly the world becomes different, more luminous, more wondrous. And you realize that in your poverty of spirit, the kingdom of heaven is with you in that moment. And it is wondrous. But even after that moment passes, you begin to become, over time, more and more aware of that presence with you all the time. You begin to see glimpses of it in the strangest of places, like even when your landscaper unexpectedly hugs you. And you realize the kingdom of heaven is with you right here, right now. And more than that, it leads you also to be more aware, to mind the gaps, so that as you mind them, Jesus narrows them, and you learn to lead, grow to lead a wiser and kinder life. And in the midst of all those things, you realize that Jesus is with you in every moment. And you begin to see the miracles among which you walk, the wonder and beauty of the kingdom of heaven that is with you right now. Do you want to experience the presence of God like that? Then grieve your gaps. Grieve the gaps between who you are and who you yearn to be, who God created you to be. Because as you do that, as your heart opens, then the God who in Jesus crossed every gap to reach you, the gap between heaven and earth, the gap between God and humanity, the gap even between life and death. And Jesus crossed those gaps in order to close them. This Jesus will be with you and in you. And as Jesus moves into you, falls into you, not only will Jesus start closing those gaps bit by bit, but he will give you eyes to see the wonder and the beauty of God's kingdom that is with you in every moment. And then you will discover that the kingdom of heaven is not something you experience just when you die. It is there to experience while you live, even now. For as you grieve your gaps, you open yourself to the presence of God like never before. Do you want that? Begins quite simply. So, why don't we take a moment to try it right now? A little bit of training, so to speak. What we're going to do is I'm going to pull out my handy phone, and I'm going to invite you for just 2 minutes to meditate upon this prayer that has been prayed by Christians for over 1,500 years. And if the word sinner it brings back trauma from maybe a mean nun or some other experience in your past, then just change it to have mercy on me, my gaps, on my brokenness. The point of the prayer is not the words. The point of the prayer is the intention, is the attentiveness. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to invite you either to close your eyes or keep your eyes open. Either way is fine. And in a moment, I'm going to start this timer. So think about that prayer. Jesus, Lamb of God, have mercy on me, a sinner. In fact, why don't we say it together? Jesus, Lamb of God, have mercy on me, a sinner. And what I'd like you to do is just repeat those words quietly to yourself. Meditate upon them. You might find that the words fade away, that you lost touch with the words, but they're still present in you. And I invite you to do that right now. Jesus, Lamb of God, have mercy on me, a sinner. Maybe something happened. Maybe nothing happened. Maybe you're like, dadgum, 2 minutes is a long time. But even that is a revelation. How often do we let 2 minutes pass and not realize how much is in just 2 minutes? That sometimes we're not even aware of the eternity of time in just a few moments. But what I invite you to do is to try that practice on. Maybe it'll work for you, maybe it won't. Maybe you'll need to modify the words. Maybe it'll simply be Jesus, Lamb of God, or whatever. But take some time in the silence. Maybe as you walk around your house or walk in your neighborhood or just are hanging out. Anytime. You can do it anytime. And see what happens. See if you begin to feel the gap. Experience the grief. And more profoundly, experience the presence of the God who is with you always.